Hi, and welcome to Studio 411. My name is Larry De Silva. Did you know that it's never been scientifically proven that the brain produces consciousness, or that the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, scientifically proved that remote viewing, and that's the ability for a person to describe a target that is inaccessible to normal senses due to distance and or time, is in fact a real phenomena through countless meticulously conducted experiments? Well, now that I've totally confused you, well, we've got a gentleman who's going to be joining us in a minute that is going to help clarify that and a lot more. Mark Gober is going to be joining us. He has written a book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, published by Waterside Press, and website markgober.com. We've got a little video to shed a little light on the book. Let's take a look. And with that, we welcome to Studio 411 author Mark Gober. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
Now tell me, this is quite an undertaking. I know when I was looking at it at first, it appeared quite daunting, and I'm going to do my best to not only educate myself in addition to our listeners. Tell me a little bit about your background and what inspired you to write this book.
So my background on the surface has nothing to do with the topic of my book. I work in the business financial world. I initially worked in investment banking with UBS in New York during the financial crisis. And for the last 9+ years, I've been with a firm called Sherpa Technology Group. I'm based in Silicon Valley, and I'm a partner there. We advise businesses, usually technology businesses, on their intellectual property strategy from a business standpoint. So when I tell people about my business background, they typically wonder why I wrote a book on consciousness. And it all started for me in the summer of 2016. I was listening to podcasts. I wasn't intending to learn about consciousness, but I ended up hearing an episode of a woman who described phenomena around consciousness that I had never heard about before. Things like psychic abilities, things like communicating with the deceased, things that I had heard about it in maybe a science fiction capacity, but never in a serious way. So I wasn't swayed by that one interview, but I ended up listening to many more podcasts, and starting with a show called Healing Powers, and then ultimately looking at scientific research, including research from the CIA, from Princeton University, from the University of Virginia, and much beyond that. So I spent about a year just learning as much as I could, because I wanted to understand these phenomena and understand how they could fit into a picture of reality that would make sense. And then after that year of research, decided to write the book, which I ended up writing in 2017 and was published in 2018.
Now, you discuss a framework to consider while reading this book. Tell us a little bit what that framework consists of.
The conventional view of reality, and this is both in the scientific community but also just in everyday thinking, it's known in scientific terms as materialism. And I don't mean by materialism people who like fancy cars or jewelry. I'm talking about a scientific philosophy which basically says the following. It says that about 13.8 billion years ago, there was an event that started the universe. It's often called the Big Bang. So the Big Bang filled the universe with physical material that we call matter, and this is why it's called materialism. So we have pieces of matter all throughout this big universe, and we end up with pieces of matter interacting with each other, and that's typically called chemistry. So we started with matter, and now we have chemical reactions happening, chemistry. When you have enough random chemical reactions, chance tells us that we're bound to end up with a molecule that can replicate itself. That's like DNA. So we started with matter. Now we have biological organisms that were started with DNA. And with the evolution of biological organisms, we end up with a being that has a brain, like a human being. And from the brain comes out our consciousness. And when I say consciousness, I want to define it because we'll be speaking a lot about it. I mean our subjective inner experience. So anyone watching this show right now has a consciousness that is experiencing the watching of this show. When I say I am speaking, that I is what I mean by consciousness. It's kind of our identity, our subjective experience. So in short, materialism says that matter via a brain creates consciousness. And that was certainly my perspective before I began my research. Like I said, it's the perspective of much of the scientific community and a lot of modern society. If you take that perspective as being factual, then it has implications for how we think about life. So if the brain creates consciousness, if the brain creates our sense of being or awareness, then what happens when the brain turns off, i.e. when the body dies? Then there's no consciousness anymore. So this model would predict that when we die, there's no consciousness. And then that has implications for thinking about whether or not life has any meaning. And I can tell you my perspective before I began my research was very nihilistic. There's no meaning in life because once you die, it's over. And that's the materialist perspective that ultimately I end up challenging in my book.
And now, you know, in reading the book, I thought to myself, well, this isn't necessarily an assault on scientists in general. Lord knows, it seems like these days they're, you know, when it comes to things like the ice melting and global warming, that the scientists seem to be under attack at every moment. However, your thing that I perceive from the book is that scientists at times, when they're not sure about something, they kind of stick close to the vest. They don't want to like go out there and say, well, this could be true, that could be true. If they don't, you know, believe in something, or they don't feel that it's they have the correct answer or something to add to the equation, all these years they've just kind of played it real close to the vest. Does that make any sense, or am I off on that?
No, I think you're right, and I think the bigger the issue, the more reluctant certain scientists might be. And here, what you and I are speaking about is ultimately a meta paradigm. It's the paradigm of all of reality. It underlies all other paradigms that we really think about. So if there is a challenge to this materialist perspective, it would make sense that we would see resistance to it. And that's what I think we're seeing in many areas of science. However, what I think is the case, and what led me to feel comfortable enough to actually write a book on this topic with my name on it, is that there is real scientific evidence, so sticking within the scientific realm, that is challenging some of our core assumptions. And that was the focus of the book.
There's, at the end of the book, which is great, you have a kind of a glossary of different terms, like some of the ones you've explained, and I'm sure Mark will explain several more throughout the hour. We'll start with one, terminal lucidity. Tell me about that.
Terminal lucidity is the ability for someone who is, let's just say someone who has Alzheimer's disease. That person might not have certain memories for a long period of time, but shortly before dying, the person snaps back into it as if he or she were speaking completely normally. So whatever memory loss was existing before just disappears, and then the person dies shortly thereafter. And so this is a phenomenon that doesn't really make sense under the conventional paradigm of the brain. It's not well understood. And the reason that I mention it in the book is that it's viewing the brain in a different perspective than the materialist perspective. Again, the materialist view says the brain creates consciousness. And what I'm arguing in the book is that actually it's not that matter via the brain creates consciousness. It's upside down. It's that consciousness is fundamental. So to quote Max Planck, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, he said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." So getting back to terminal lucidity, how does this all fit in? Well, if the brain's not creating consciousness, we know the brain's related to consciousness. We have a whole field of neuroscience. Then what's the relationship between the brain and consciousness? Well, what if the brain is like a filtering mechanism or a processor of consciousness? Then we might expect, when we get the brain out of the way, when the brain has a reduction in functioning, then we might experience more consciousness. Less brain, more consciousness. That would be the brain as like a filtering mechanism.
Gotcha.
And there are a number of examples where we see the brain as not being very functional, and yet there's a lucid consciousness. Terminal lucidity is one example. There are more extreme cases, like a near-death experience, where a person has minimal or no brain functioning and a highly lucid experience.
And you refer to that as an NDE, if I'm not mistaken. And again, there's other symbols or terminology for different things we're going to be talking about. Mark Gober joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, published by Waterside Press. For more information, www.markgober.com. Just a slew. I mean, my God, it encompasses almost the entire sleeve on both sides of accolades and positive comments about the book. Jack Canfield, who many of you may know, New York Times bestselling author of the Success Principles, and best known probably as co-creator of Chicken Soup for the Soul book series. He said about the book and Mark's efforts, quote, "I love this book. An End to Upside Down Thinking will get you thinking. This book is full of positive, insightful, and powerful information." Now, I have to ask, since the book came out not long ago, what has been the overall kind of reception of it? Obviously, there's many people from all walks of life, actors, Nobel Prize winning folks, scientists, whatever, but have you gotten, would it be safe to say, skeptical comments from others who don't necessarily buy into what you're talking about?
Most of the feedback has been very positive, and I get emails all the time, which is very nice. I always appreciate that. I haven't received as much negative feedback directly to me. I have seen comments here and there on the internet, and what I've found is that they are typically referring to fraudulent research. They're claiming research that is fraudulent, and I haven't seen evidence that is actually the case for many of those claims. So I think there has been kind of a stigma against a lot of these phenomena, psychic abilities, surviving bodily death. But over time, we've seen an increase in really credible research, which I think is new relative to the past. Before, we had maybe anecdotes here and there. Now there are much stronger scientific studies, in my opinion, and an accumulation of some really strong anecdotes. I'll give one example of a mainstream publication, for example, that put out an article actually in 2018. American Psychologist Journal, which is the official peer-reviewed journal of the American Psychological Association. So as mainstream as it gets in psychology. And they published a meta-analysis, meaning when you combine the results of many experiments and you look at the statistics, these studies show that psychic phenomena, a variety of them, are happening beyond what chance would predict. And American Psychologist accepted this article and decided to publish it. And in fact, I spoke with a scientist, Dr. Etzel Cardenia, who published the paper, and he told me that American Psychologist gave him a hard time before actually publishing it, and he was debating whether or not he should just publish it in another journal. But ultimately, even though this field has endured lots of scrutiny over many decades, they decided to publish the article. So I think that's a sign that things are starting to change, and we have really credible outlets that are talking about this important research.
I was trying to come up, and I'm sure you have a few comparisons. Someone that, how do I put this? In other words, what you're trying to convey to the public at large, how would you compare, for instance, to someone else that perhaps 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, had the same problem in saying, oh, I'll give you, for instance, the Earth is flat. Well, we all know the Earth, ships aren't going to, fall off the edge, which seemed to be the prevailing theory back in the 13th or 14th century, perhaps even earlier. Give me, is there another example of someone well-known in history that had a tough time trying to convey a series of ideas or thoughts and was met with a lot of skepticism?
It happens all the time, and actually in the field in which I work with intellectual property, we see this with every invention, because an invention that is patentable is novel and non-obvious relative to what was done before, meaning someone is taking what's known as the prior art, the standard way of doing things, and doing something new and challenging the paradigm. So I'm very accustomed to seeing a paradigm that's being challenged. In terms of historical examples, there are two that are popping to mind. One is germ theory, the idea that microscopic organisms like bacteria could make us sick or kill us. At one point, that was totally crazy. And now with the microscope, we can see that those things actually exist, and we now know that it's a real phenomenon, that we can get sick or actually die from microscopic organisms. That's one. Another that this area of consciousness is often compared to is what Galileo faced when he had his evidence in the telescope, which suggested that the Earth is not at the center of the solar system. And the clergymen, certain clergymen, didn't want to look in his telescope to see the evidence because it challenged their worldview. And now we know that Galileo was right, and the Copernican revolution, we're now in a new era of science and how we think of ourselves in the universe. But at one point, that was a totally ludicrous idea. So actually, the cover of my book, Dr. Eben Alexander, a former Harvard neurosurgeon, was kind enough to endorse the book. And what he talks about with this general thesis that consciousness is fundamental, which not only am I saying, many other people are saying it, I'm kind of summarizing the research. He says that he thinks this notion will make the Copernican revolution seem relatively minor by comparison. And this is why I think he said that. Even with the Copernican revolution, or with the idea that we used to think the Earth is flat, those were changes in the way we thought about the external world around us. Whereas with consciousness, that's our identity. We're thinking about, are we a body that has a consciousness? That's the materialist perspective. Our identity is our physical body. Everything is material. Consciousness just comes out of it. Or alternatively, is our identity tied to our consciousness? And the body is just a lens through which we experience a physical world. Now, if the latter is true, which is what I'm suggesting with the book, we are talking about a shift in how we view our own identity, which is a huge deal.
You talk in the book, memory transmitted via non-brain organs. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, this is in chapter 2 of the book, and I describe several anecdotes in which a person receives an organ from someone else and then ends up taking on personality traits or even fears of the person that they received the organ from. And there's one case that I mention of a girl who received an organ of someone who had been murdered. At the time, she didn't know that she received the organ from someone who had been murdered, but she began having terrible nightmares and saw a psychiatrist. And then they realized, wait a second, she received an organ from someone who had been murdered. Let's listen to the details that she is giving her psychiatrist. And according to the story, which is described in The Heart's Code by Paul Pearsall, they were able to track down the murderer of the person who gave the organ, based on the memories that seem to have been transmitted into the little girl who received the organ. And the reason that I mention anecdotes like this, which are, if they're true, they're incredible, and they make us have to rethink memory. What I'm doing in that chapter is challenging the notion that our consciousness is solely coming from the brain, which is the materialist perspective. Terminal lucidity and other near-death experiences, they're challenging the relationship. So is the organ transplant donor phenomenon, where memories seem to be transmitted through something that's not even the brain. So again, it's just making us challenge our assumptions about the brain and consciousness and memory.
I'm thinking back, I think I remember as a kid, it was like 1967 when I remember the first heart transplant. Dr. Christian Bernard of South Africa performed it, and everybody was like, you know, especially as a kid, we were like, oh my God, it's almost like Frankenstein-like at the time, you know. And I remember the individual who really was willing and able and needed the transplant didn't live more than 5 or 6 days, but obviously made his contribution to science. But there's an example going back to the late 60s where it would have been fascinating with that first individual to then monitor, you know, what if any of this, you know, would happen with him. And I'm sure it was monitored later on, whether anyone paid a close attention to it like we would now. Another one too, and this is you know, straight out of today's headlines, in this whole realm of even touching on which we're going to do psychic phenomena. There was a story about a gentleman in Florida, a parent, and literally was shaken, or almost like felt like this jolt within his own being. And it turned out that he believes at that very moment his daughter was murdered. I forget if it was Indiana or Illinois, but anyway, it was a relatively you know, long distance away. And, you know, again, amazing. He just knew that something had gone wrong. Maybe he didn't know with whom, but it turned out his daughter that was either traveling or living away from home. And there you go. I mean, it's kind of scary in a way because we don't have a grasp on why it happens, or at least the average person doesn't. I mean, I'm sure you folks have different theories on why that occurs, and it seems to be occurring more so than not these days.
There are some theories on why that occurs, and I would say that's probably an example of telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, which is one of the areas that I explore. The explanation could be something known as entanglement, which is a phenomenon that has been accepted as being a real thing in quantum physics, which is a field of physics that's been around for the last 100 years. Albert Einstein called entanglement spooky action at a distance. This was something he tried to disprove because of the implications. But ultimately, and I'm just simplifying this dramatically, if you have one particle here and another particle, meaning a piece of matter, that's far away, when you affect the one that's close by, the one that's far away is affected at the exact same instant. And that was controversial because it used to be thought that the speed of light was the fastest that anything could actually be traveling. And here we have an effect that is instantaneous, which is faster than the speed of light. So what's happening? We don't see a connection between those particles, but the fact that there is an instantaneous reaction suggests that maybe there's an invisible connection. So Dr. Dean Radin, who's a scientist in this area, he's the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. He wrote a book called Entangled Minds, which is this notion that maybe consciousness is really fundamental and we are entangled as part of the same interconnected consciousness. It's taking quantum physics and consciousness and kind of bringing it together. So to quote Erwin Schrödinger, who is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, famous physicist, he said, "In truth, there is only one mind." And maybe these phenomena of quantum entanglement and sensing something at a distance, especially when there's an emotional closeness, maybe these are symptoms of a one mind where we are kind of part of the same underlying consciousness.
Mark Gober joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, published by Waterside Press. For more information, markgober.com. To continue talking about some examples you give in the book, there's even a story in there about former President Jimmy Carter, who of course has lived quite a long life and experienced a lot of things. Tell us about the story you share about President Carter.
Well, that was with regard to a phenomenon known as remote viewing, which is the ability to perceive something that's far away, meaning your eyes aren't seeing it, but somehow with your mind you can access it. This is something that is not well explained, if it's real, by the materialist view that the brain produces consciousness and consciousness is just stuck in our skulls. However, if consciousness is fundamental, and another idea that I speak about in the book is not only is consciousness fundamental, but it's beyond all space and time. If that were true, then these non-local phenomena at least could be conceivable. So that's what we're talking about, remote viewing. And as you mentioned earlier, the U.S. government ran a program for more than 20 years in which they spent over $20 million using psychic spies for national security. And what you're referring to with former U.S. President Jimmy Carter is that he confirmed that in one instance, remote viewers were used to find a downed Russian bomber that was lost in an African jungle. In other words, the radar systems that we had at the time could not find this downed Russian bomber,
right.
So they used remote viewers. And Jimmy Carter confirmed that they used remote viewers. And there's a new documentary that came out by Russell Targ, who's one of the laser physicists who ran this U.S. government program out of the Stanford Research Institute in the 70s and 80s. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him for my forthcoming podcast. I'm interviewing many of the scientists that cover these topics. And he has a documentary out called Third Eye Spies. And the documentary begins with Jimmy Carter, an audio clip of Jimmy Carter talking about this, that it was one of the strangest things that he experienced in his presidency.
There's a guy to get on your podcast. I wouldn't mind him on this show, President Carter. Outstanding. Now, talking about that, what is the difference, if there is a difference, back again when all of us were growing up, you'd have these stories that someone who possesses some kind of psychic ability, they'd call them in and then they would help them solve a murder case or, cases, whether they were verified as actually happening, where a person with some sort of psychic ability or would lead them to where the body or the evidence was. I mean, if that's the case, we need to get somebody to find Jimmy Hoffa, but that hasn't happened yet.
There are cases where detectives and law enforcement have used remote viewers. It's something I've uncovered in my research, going back to Russell Targ, again, the laser physicist who ran the U.S. government remote viewing program. When I spoke with him in my interview, which will be released later this year, he spoke about a famous case, Patty Hearst, the heiress to the Hearst family.
Yes.
She was kidnapped, and later she was found. But years later, it was revealed that remote viewers were used to help find her.
Really? I was not aware of. Yeah, I know there's always been a question whether she was brainwashed, or there's a term, for instance, like when some of these young children are kidnapped and then held for umpteen years, although in her case it was not as long as some of those cases, but that when she was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, that she in effect became almost like a surrogate of theirs, kind of a believer or whatever, and then a lot of people didn't buy that because, as soon as she got released, she was actually brought up on charges, and then I guess eventually she did go to jail for some time, but a lot of folks believe that she was actually coerced or brainwashed, and, to this day, it's still a mystery how much of that is true, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, and what I hear is that it's kind of a last resort for most law enforcement. And I actually spoke with a woman who has some of these abilities, remote viewing, psychic abilities, for my podcast. And she says that she is contacted sometimes by law enforcement. It's just not the first place people go. And it's not, like many psychic phenomena, it's not always 100% reliable. And that's an important point that I always like to address, is that sometimes there could be a failed trial, and you could have a skeptic say, well, psychic phenomena are not real. Look, you saw that person failed. That's not what we're looking at, however, in order to determine whether a phenomenon is real. What we're looking at is whether the phenomenon happens beyond what chance would predict. And sometimes you need statistics to determine that. Sometimes it's more extreme, like in the case of Jimmy Carter and a few others that the U.S. government performed. In other cases, it's more subtle, where it's not 100% accurate, but it works sometimes.
Now, you talk about, in the book, the famed astronomer Carl Sagan. Many of you may remember Carl made many appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. I can remember seeing him and always was fascinated by his theories about different things. Of course, had the tremendous show, I think it was on public broadcasting, called Cosmos, which was a book as well as a television series. Sagan was a skeptic about a lot of this stuff that you're talking about, but yet seemed incredibly curious. Would you say that at least the fact that he was curious was a little bit more than some scientists or some people that are in these various fields?
I think it depends on who you ask. There are some people, and I discuss this in the book, who will say things along the lines of, there's no evidence for psychic phenomena, they are not real, physics shows that these things cannot be possible, and some of those people have not seemed as open. There are others who might be skeptical but somewhat open, and I think Carl Sagan is an example of that. There's a quote that I use in my book where he says that certain areas deserve serious study. And one has to do with children who seem to remember previous lives in which it's not understood how they could have remembered these things. And that's referring to research that's been done at the University of Virginia, their Division of Perceptual Studies, for more than 50 years, over 2,500 cases of kids that have these memories. And sometimes they actually have birthmarks and physical deformities that align with how they died in this alleged previous life. So that's one area that Carl Sagan said deserved serious study. Another area was the ability to affect physical matter or a computer system with the mind alone. And these were studies that were run at Princeton University by the former Dean of Engineering and at other places around the world, where a person is asked to try to influence a machine. It's called a random number generator, meaning the machine will generate a 0 or a 1 in a totally random fashion. When you look at the string of zeros and ones, since it's random, you end up with about 50% ones, 50% zeros. What happens, however, if you ask a person, We say, hey, Larry, I want you to try to put your mind to the machine and make it produce more ones than zeros. When you look at the statistics, it's tiny, but highly statistically significant, where there are more ones than zeros, which insinuates that maybe the mind is having an effect on the physical world. It's known as psychokinesis. That was something that Sagan was interested in. And the third phenomenon is one of telepathy, and where you have one person in a room, another person who's far away in another room, and that person who's far away, we'll call her Jane. Jane is looking at a picture that the experimenters give her, and they ask Jane to try to mentally send to this person in the other room, we'll call him Bob, whatever she's looking at. Bob is then given 4 pictures to look at, and they say, Bob, which of the 4 was Jane trying to send to you? And if it were just a totally chance thing, Bob would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times, 25%, if there were no effect. However, when you combine many results over many decades and different experimenters, it's closer to 32%, which from a statistical standpoint, it's known as a 6 sigma result, meaning the odds that's just a chance occurrence is more than 1 billion to 1. So things like that interested Carl Sagan.
I think I might be psychic. There's been quite a few times during the run of this show that it's amazing how my director will seem to know what I'm wanting, and yet I don't know if it's a telepathy or maybe just a look on my face. I don't know. But anyway, it runs about 50%, I can tell you that. Mark Gober joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. The book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, published by Waterside Press. For more information, markgober.com. You don't mention this individual in the book, but I have to ask if you have any knowledge of her. Certainly you should as an actress. The Oscar-winning actress Shirley MacLaine for years, I mean, best-selling books, and she talked about that she was, had been experienced other lives, et cetera, was with Napoleon or was with this one or that one. I mean, and people, because she was an actress, they figured, well, she's a good writer, let her go on and talk about all this stuff, but yet I'm sure a certain segment said, hey, what she's saying must be true. I mean, any knowledge of Shirley and some of her what were deemed outlandish theories?
Well, a number of people have asked me the same question. I haven't studied her work in particular, but the notion of past lives is something that I would have rejected as being impossible or just nonsensical based on the materialist perspective. Because if consciousness comes from the brain, once you die, that's the end of your consciousness. So how could it be that your consciousness is continuing from someone who died? That just doesn't make sense. But if we say consciousness is fundamental, and I'll give an analogy that might help your audience. It certainly helped me when I learned this. It's from Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who incidentally, he wrote a book called Why Materialism is Baloney. So he was taking a really hard look at materialism.
Definitely a book that piqued your interest, I can tell.
But his analogy was to say that all of reality is like a stream of water, where water represents consciousness. Each of us is like a whirlpool within that stream, meaning we're all made of consciousness. We're fundamentally interconnected, but it seems like we're separate because there are boundaries. We have these localizations of consciousness. So I'm a whirlpool, Larry, you're another one. Each listener is a whirlpool, but we're connected as part of the same stream. There are a number of implications of this. One is, imagine if some of the water from my whirlpool got into another person's whirlpool. That's like some of my consciousness getting into their consciousness. That's like a psychic or telepathic ability. So according to this model, psychic abilities are not paranormal. They are expected. We would predict them. Another prediction is, let's say the whirlpool dissolves into the broader stream. That would be like when the physical body dies, consciousness, i.e. the water, hasn't left the stream. It simply transitions into a new state. So this second prediction is, when the body dies, consciousness doesn't die, it just transitions. So that idea under this model would not be paranormal. And now getting to this notion of reincarnation, if we imagine that one whirlpool dissolves into the broader stream and then reconfigures into a new whirlpool, maybe with some of the water from the old whirlpool and maybe from water from another one, that's like reincarnation. It's like recycling of the consciousness. Right. So under this model, reincarnation and some of the ideas that you talked about and Shirley MacLaine talked about and the University of Virginia studying, those ideas are actually predicted rather than being paranormal.
Gotcha. Another gentleman, I remember growing up as a kid seeing him, and it was kind of brought back memories when I read about him in your book, a gentleman by the name of Uri Geller. We have a photo of Uri. And tell the audience a little bit about Uri. I'll tell this one story ahead of time. He was known for like being able to allegedly bend spoons, and it was a terrible thing that occurred. He was on the Merv Griffin show. This is back in like the early to mid 70s, and here he was up on a stage, you know, with probably 200-300 people in the audience, and Merv next to him. And I hate to say it, but you know what? They must have been with him about 20 minutes, which today would be unheard of. And guess what? The spoon didn't bend. So I know he did a lot of things and had a lot of success. But tell me a little bit about Mr. Geller and what he believed on these subjects.
He's, as you mentioned, a famous psychic from Israel. He's another person that I interviewed for my forthcoming podcast, so I got to speak with him about all these topics. What was interesting for me as a researcher was that the CIA recently declassified a number of documents from the 70s and 80s from this remote viewing program that we discussed. Mm-hmm. One of the documents says very explicitly, which is included in my book, so this is a direct quote, "Remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary." So those are some of the things that the CIA was apparently saying behind closed doors. But also there are documents about Uri Geller. And there's a document that talks about a remote viewing experiment that was done with him where he was put in an electrically shielded room. And they took great care to make sure that he couldn't see the thing that he was supposed to be able to see with his mind, and that he demonstrated his, I believe what they called paranormal perceptual abilities in a clear and unambiguous manner. So a pretty glowing endorsement from these internal CIA documents, which caught my attention. And when I spoke with Mr. Geller about it, he said that those documents were just the tip of the iceberg, and that there was a lot that had been conducted and a lot of successes that he showed in his career. The spoon bending phenomenon, it's something that I looked into as well. There were instances where it didn't work, such as the one that you mentioned on a TV show. And there are a number of other people that seem to think that's something he can do. And the phenomenon of spoon bending, which is psychokinesis, again, mind affecting matter. This is an example of macro psychokinesis, whereas the random number generator experiments, where it's just a tiny shift in the number of ones and zeros in a machine, that's a micro psychokinesis. These macro phenomena are much more difficult to test, and they seem to be more erratic.
You talk about in the book, and I was curious about this because I think we've all had this feeling. You talk about the sense of being stared at. Is that, you know how like sometimes you're in a room with people, you may know them, you may not know them, and all of a sudden you kind of look back like, you know, who's staring at me? Or in a murder mystery, who's walking behind me, even though you probably hear them walking behind you. But again, tell me a little bit about that. I mean, what kind of studies were done, or is that just something that, you know, just people just think of when they are in a crowded room, or they feel maybe uncomfortable, that they can sense that an individual is staring at them?
Well, it's reported anecdotally in many different areas. Snipers, for example, report that people seem to know when they're being stared at, even, you know, through a gun many miles away. There's this sense that there's a kind of a connection somehow, that the person knows and they might move. The paparazzi is another example, when a celebrity seems to know they're being stared at. So anecdotally, we've seen this before. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who is a former Cambridge biochemist, has sought to test this in a laboratory setting to see if there is an effect beyond what chance would predict, where a person shouldn't be able to know that they're being stared at, but more often than not, more often than what chance would predict, they do. And he showed this to be true in a room where a person is divided from another. But I think the most compelling ones are when a person is staring at someone else through a closed circuit TV camera. So they're not even in the same room. You can't claim that there's any physical contact. And the person who's being stared at seems to know beyond what chance would predict that they're being stared at. So this might, again, be an example of entanglement. Something that's happening at a distance, non-locally, where there's an interconnectivity. And when the intention is put out, or when there's an emotion or something, we seem to be able to pick it up, even if it's a subtle reaction.
Now, you talk about telephone telepathy, and once again, I think all of us at one point or another in our lives can relate to this, where you're thinking of someone, or maybe a person is having a rough time of you know, their lives. Maybe there's been a tragedy. Maybe there's been good news that has occurred, and it's amazing. All of a sudden, the phone rings, and the person is like, or in these days it could be a text as well or an email, and all of a sudden you're like, how did this person, it's almost like they were psychic, like they knew that, maybe that person needed to be reached out to.
It's another area that Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has studied in a controlled manner, where he's examining whether this seems to be happening beyond chance, because so many people report it. And I actually like to use that as an example of the way in which telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, which this might be demonstrating, seems to work, which is that it doesn't happen 100% of the time that we're thinking of someone and then we get a text. And maybe it's someone we haven't thought of in a while, and we say, wait a second, was that a chance occurrence, or was something going on there? Was I reading the future? Was it telepathy? It seems to happen every now and then. This is kind of the 32 versus 25% that I was referring to earlier in the telepathy experiment, where it's happening beyond what chance would predict, but it's not all the time. It's not 100% of the time. And if it were, then we would be reading each other's minds all the time, and yet that's not what we see. Instead, we see a subtle effect that seems to be happening just beyond chance, but not all the time.
You also mentioned about twins, that they appear to have or be more telepathic, or they have the ability to kind of know what's going on, or have a little bit more insight than other siblings where they're not twins. Talk a little bit about that. I found that amazing.
There seems to be something with twins where they know what's happening at a distance more than what we see with people who are not twins. And there's also something known as telesomatic events, where two people might be far away, and when something happens to the person's body in one place, the twin who's far away will feel that pain. So there's some kind of a connection that's not just a mental one. There's like a physical transference that happens in roughly 30% of cases of twins. So again, maybe it's an instance of entanglement. But another factor that I think plays into this is one of emotional closeness. The effect of telepathy, at least in emerging studies, seems to be amplified when the two people are emotionally close to one another, whether it's twins or a mother-child, people who are in a relationship with each other, things like that, where there's a bond. So these are kind of the nuances that I think need to be studied so that we can understand them better.
I'm not sure that this would fit in the criteria, but it comes to mind. I remember someone that lived in the neighborhood where I grew up at one point, and the both elderly people, let's say they were in their 80s, and the wife died, and you hear about this now and again, and literally within 24 hours, the other spouse, in this case the husband, passed away. Now, was that something that's more of a mind thing where they just will themselves to live, or is there another correlation there that that plays into it, or is it just coincidence?
It's not something that I examined in the book from the perspective of consciousness, although I do wonder, and just hearing you say that, if there is a mental component to it, that maybe they were willing each other to live by both being around, and when one was no longer there, that motivation isn't there to the same degree.
Yeah.
That would be a hypothesis, but I really don't know.
No, exactly. Mark Gober joining us for the hour here on Studio 411, the book An End to Upside Down Thinking, published by Waterside Press. www.markgober.com for more information. Let's talk a little bit precognition, knowing the future before it happens. I'm reminded of a show that used to be on. It was called Early Edition. The guy, I don't know if he had precognition, but he used to always get a newspaper that seemed to forecast the next day's events before that day came. But tell me a little bit about precognition.
Precognition is the ability to know or sense the future before it happens. And if we think back to this model of consciousness, where consciousness is beyond all space and time, it's as if consciousness is like reaching forward in time. And sometimes the body senses it in a implicit way, where it's happening on a subconscious level, or in a really explicit way. One example is precognitive dreams, where a person has a dream of an event that happens in vivid detail the next day. So they dreamt the event before it happens, including lottery tickets, lottery numbers. So there's a case of a man in Virginia.
I can never remember the
winning.
numbers. That's the problem. If I could remember the numbers, but it's like a guy I was just hearing about. I don't know, it was Paul McCartney or somebody that dreamt like about an experience and then lyrics to a song, and then they wake up and instantaneously write it down. Well, I don't know. These folks must spring out of bed. I just kind of roll over, and then the next morning I don't remember what it was. I have kind of a vague memory of it, but I admire folks that are able to just, immediately make a notation or write it down. It's an amazing thing. But yeah, no lottery winnings for me.
Well, those are, I think, rare cases, and we'd all love to be able to do it. The most compelling studies, though, are more subtle in effect, again, using statistics, where you have a person looking at a computer screen, and the computer screen shows one of two types of pictures. One picture might be like a peaceful landscape, something very neutral. Another type of picture would be arousing, so like an erotic image, a violent image, something that we know would arouse the body, whether it's the skin, the pupils, the heart, the brain. We know that the body reacts to those sorts of things. So what the experimenters do is measure the person's body before the picture is shown. And no one knows what picture is going to be shown because it's randomly selected by the computer. And what the experimenters find is that the body seems to subtly respond in a direction consistent with the eventual picture shown. It's truly remarkable if that's true. It's Darrell Bem, who's a former Cornell professor. He wrote a paper called Feeling the Future about this idea, and Dr. Julia Mossbridge and several others have done meta-analyses where you combine the results. It suggests that the body seems to know the future before it happens.
Another part of the book that I found amazing, because again, I think anyone who has a pet or some kind of animal can relate to psychic abilities of animals. And I'll share this one story. I don't think I have this particular one in my house, but my dog keeps me busy enough. But you tell the story of a bear returning to the site, and he had been tagged, returning to the same area. And I think I read about this here in Connecticut. Was transported, let's say 400 miles away, and call it 6 cents, call it whatever, wound up, and they verified it obviously, because when they got him again, they were able to trace that, hey, this guy was just here 6 months ago, because he had the same tags that they had put on him before. So what do you make of that?
And there are some cases of pets that find their owners even though they're miles and miles away. There are theories. Well, maybe it is that the animals have incredible sense of smell or some kind of sense that we don't understand. But if we think about what we've been speaking of, which is psychic abilities in human beings, well, animals have brains, so why wouldn't it at least be possible that maybe they're employing telepathy or precognition or something like that? I think the strongest studies, and there haven't been many studies because, as you can imagine, the funding for something like this, I mean, the funding for studies on telepathy in humans is not very great, but telepathy in animals, good luck getting funding for that. Yeah. So I give Rupert Sheldrake, the Cambridge biochemist I mentioned before, a lot of credit for taking the time to study this. One case in particular was very strong. A woman named Pam who had a dog named JT. And she claimed that her dog seemed to know when she was coming home. The dog would walk to the window more often than not when she was coming home. So what Dr. Sheldrake did was control for all of the things that a skeptic might say. Well, maybe the dog heard the car, or maybe the dog knew that she was coming home at a certain time, or maybe the dog was able to smell her. So what he did was have Pam sent off in a taxi far away, miles away from home, at a randomly selected time, and she didn't even know when she was coming home. She was told by the experimenter at a random time, okay, Pam, it's time to walk to the cab. And there's actually a video of this on Dr. Sheldrake's website of one of the trials. As Pam is walking to her car, she's told it's time to walk home. Walking to the taxi, it's not her car. The dog starts to walk to the window. So it's as if the dog is picking up the intent for her to come home. And Dr. Sheldrake ran many trials and showed that this was happening beyond what chance would predict, which suggests that maybe there is a telepathic communication or telepathic ability, not only in humans, but also in animals.
No doubt, no doubt. In the remaining moments we have here with author Mark Gober on Studio 411, there was an interesting one. We talked earlier about NDE's near-death experience. Tell me about the one where they claim the blind can see during a near-death experience. I was amazed by that.
So the near-death experience, usually called the NDE, is an instance where a person has some kind of extreme physiological trauma. It might be cardiac arrest. It might be some kind of other injury where the person is highly impaired. Their brain might be completely off. It might be partially off. And we would predict with the conventional model of the brain that a person shouldn't be able to have a lucid vision or a lucid memory, and yet many people do. Sometimes people are hovering over their bodies, that's what they come back saying, and they see things that are verified as being accurate from the vantage point of being above their body. But this happens not only in people who have normal vision, but it happens in people who are blind in their body, and yet they go into this out-of-body experience during the near-death experience. They report being able to see, they come back into their body, and they go back to being blind, which is suggesting that maybe in this near-death experience state, the consciousness is functioning independently and is able to be aware of things. The researchers call it transcendental awareness. It seems to happen even when the brain is not functional.
So much data that many of us didn't know about. Why do you think wasn't or isn't this info talked about more often? I mean, I guess it may go back to what we started the show off with, but you would think with the ways we have to reach out to people, be it you joining us today while you're traveling in England, or via text or any kind of communication, not just books and letters. But again, do you think that so many of the things you talk about and that your colleagues throughout the world support you on, do you think that that these things will start to gain more steam? I mean, have you noticed an increase in more acceptance of this just since you released the book?
I'm becoming optimistic that there is so much information in independent areas. And one of the points that I make in the book is I'm not claiming that every instance is 100% bulletproof. I can't. If it were just one study or one phenomenon, I wouldn't have been able to write a book. But it's more like the analogy of a bundle of twigs. It's really hard to break the bundle, but you could break any individual twig. And now that we're at the point where I think we have lots of twigs together in a bundle, where it becomes harder to shoot things down. And I'm hoping that we're going to see more momentum, although when other times I think about it, I remember the taboo and I'll hear certain reactions to the studies, and there is major resistance to it. One of the scientists I spoke with, Dr. Jeff Mishlove, for my forthcoming podcast, he's been studying these things for decades, and I asked him whether he's optimistic about whether things are going to be turning anytime soon, and he said he's not optimistic that it's going to happen anytime soon. He thinks it'll happen, but it's going to take a long time because many of these studies have been out there for a long time and they haven't gained traction yet. So maybe, like you say, with technology and YouTube and programs like yours that are willing to speak about these topics and have me on the show, the information will be out there. And now we can at least critically evaluate the data set and determine whether or not it's real, rather than just kind of sweeping it under the rug.
In the couple of moments we have, I just wanted to talk about, you mentioned about the implication of AI, which for those of you who don't recall, artificial intelligence. What should we expect in the next generation as far as artificial intelligence?
There is a show called Westworld, which plays out kind of a doomsday scenario that machines, artificial intelligence, which kind of look like humans, but they're just machines, all of a sudden they become conscious, meaning they have their own feelings, and they have greed, and they have the human emotions, basically, and they end up taking over. This is one of the big debates. Will AI be able to take over? Will AI be able to become conscious? And this gets back to where we started. Is it that consciousness is emerging from physical matter, which is what the show Westworld seems to be endorsing implicitly, that the machines become conscious? What I would argue is that new consciousness will not be created from a machine, because consciousness doesn't come from matter. However, we could create a machine with an algorithm to do things that are really terrible. But that's not because the machine is conscious per se. It's because of the programmer. So in my opinion, the dangers of artificial intelligence that we're hearing about in the news and sometimes on shows is in the programmer, in how responsible or irresponsible we are in how we make these machines.
And then to Upside Down Thinking, fascinating book, fascinating gentleman, Mark Gober, published by Waterside Press, www.markgober.com. Mark, thank you for helping break down so many of these concepts that are in your book. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and we look forward to having you back on again.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we thank you for joining us here on Studio 411. Larry DeSilva, my name. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care.